Welcome to Compact Biographies from compactbiographies.com, where we tell you interesting things about interesting people in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 235. Brigitte Bardot. Brigitte Bardot did not intend to change cinema. She did not plan to become a symbol of sexual liberation, a fashion reference point, or a cultural lightning rod. Yet by the time she was barely in her 20s, she had already altered how women were seen on screen and how fame itself was understood. Her story is not a straightforward ascent to stardom, nor a cautionary tale about celebrity. It is a life marked by contradiction, vulnerability, conviction, and reinvention. Bardot was adored and resented, celebrated and criticized, imitated and misunderstood. She was a woman whose image became global property while her inner life remained fiercely guarded. To understand Brigitte Bardot is to understand an era, a tension between freedom and exposure, between beauty and burden, between public fascination and private cost. Brigitte Anne-Marie Bardot was born in Paris on the 28th of September 1934 into a conservative upper-middle-class family. Her upbringing was structured, disciplined, and rooted in traditional Catholic values. Her parents valued propriety and restraint, qualities that would later sit uneasily beside their daughter's public image. From an early age, Bardot showed a sensitivity that set her apart. She was shy, introspective, and emotionally intense. As a child, she struggled with loneliness and a sense of not quite fitting in. Her refuge came through the arts, particularly ballet. Dance offered her order, control, and expression. She trained rigorously, spending hours perfecting movement and posture. Ballet shaped not only her body, but her sense of self. It taught her discipline, grace, and endurance, qualities that would later serve her well in front of a camera. It was through ballet that she first entered the orbit of fashion and photography. Her looks were noticed, her presence striking even in stillness. At 15, she appeared on the cover of Elle, a major fashion magazine. The image caught the attention of film producers, opening a door she had not actively sought, but did not resist. Bardot's early film roles were modest. She appeared in light comedies and was given supporting parts, still very much a teenager, still learning how to exist under scrutiny. The camera loved her, but she had not yet found her voice or her place within cinema. That changed when she met a young director who recognized something raw and modern in her presence. He saw not polish, but possibility. Together, they made a film that would ignite a cultural shift. When And God Created Woman was released in 1956, it caused immediate controversy. Bardot's character was unapologetically sensual, emotionally impulsive, and defiantly free. She did not behave as women were expected to behave on screen. She moved, danced, and desired openly. Audiences were shocked. Critics were divided. The film was banned in some places and celebrated in others. Bardot herself was suddenly everywhere. Her face, her body, her name became synonymous with a new idea of femininity. Almost overnight, she was no longer a young actress. She was an icon. As the late 1950s unfolded, Brigitte Bardot crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer simply a young French actress enjoying international attention. She became something rarer and more volatile, a cultural phenomenon. Her name was shortened into initials that required no explanation. BB was not just a person. It was a symbol, a mood, a provocation. Following the explosive success of And God Created Woman, Bardot's career accelerated at a pace that left little room for reflection. Film offers arrived from France, Italy, Britain, and Hollywood. Producers recognized that audiences were not merely watching her films, they were responding to an energy that felt new and unsettling. Bardot did not project glamour in the traditional sense. She appeared natural, spontaneous, sometimes awkward, sometimes defiant. She laughed too loudly, moved too freely, and seemed unconcerned with pleasing anyone. In films such as La Parisienne in 1957, she embodied a playful modernity that contrasted sharply with the polished femininity of earlier screen stars. Her characters were impulsive and emotionally driven, often bored by convention and resistant to authority. These were not women seeking approval. They were women acting on instinct, and that instinct unsettled audiences accustomed to clearer moral boundaries. Her performance in La Vérité, released in English as The Truth in 1960, marked a significant shift. In the film, Bardot played a young woman on trial, her personal life scrutinized and condemned by society. The parallels with her own experience were difficult to ignore. On screen, she appeared fragile, defiant, and emotionally exposed, conveying a sense of alienation beneath the surface allure. Critics who had dismissed her as a novelty were forced to reconsider. There was substance beneath the image, even if the image continued to dominate public perception. The collaboration with Jean-Luc Godard in Contempt in 1963 further complicated Bardot's screen identity. In the film, she portrayed a woman whose marriage disintegrates amid miscommunication and emotional withdrawal. Godard used her image deliberately, both embracing and interrogating her status as a sex symbol. Bardot's performance was restrained, almost distant, revealing an emotional fatigue that resonated deeply with her own relationship to fame. By this point, Bardot was no longer in control of her image. Photographs of her appeared everywhere. Hairstyles, clothing, and mannerisms associated with her became global trends. The off-shoulder neckline that bore her name was only one example of how her presence shaped fashion. Yet the more ubiquitous her image became, the more alienated she felt from it. BB was adored, desired, and imitated, but the woman behind the initials experienced this transformation as a loss of self. The public consumed her image endlessly, while the private Bardot felt increasingly erased. She once described the sensation as being split in two, the woman the world believed it knew, and the woman struggling to exist beneath the projection. This period cemented her place in cultural history, but it also marked the beginning of her withdrawal. The very forces that elevated her ensured that she would one day walk away. As Bardot's film career expanded, so did the machinery surrounding her. She became a fixture of magazines, newspapers, and television, her image reproduced endlessly across borders. The media's fascination was relentless. Photographers followed her constantly. Headlines speculated about her relationships, her mental health, and her motivations. She was discussed not as an artist, but as a spectacle. During this time, Bardot also explored music, adding another layer to her public persona. She recorded several songs, most notably collaborations with Serge Gainsbourg, whose lyrics captured a mixture of melancholy, intimacy, and playful provocation. The music was not a departure from her screen image, but an extension of it. Her voice was understated, almost conversational, carrying vulnerability rather than technical polish. Songs like these reinforced her status as a symbol of 1960s French culture, blending sensuality with emotional distance. They also reflected her inner world more accurately than many of her film roles. There was longing in her voice, a sense of restlessness that mirrored her growing discomfort with fame. Behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Bardot struggled with the invasive nature of celebrity long before conversations about mental health and media intrusion became commonplace. She was photographed relentlessly, criticized harshly, and reduced to caricature. Her emotional sensitivity, once a strength, became a source of vulnerability. She experienced periods of severe depression and exhaustion. At times, she felt overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her, expected to be perpetually available, desirable, and compliant. Her private life offered little refuge. Romantic relationships were scrutinized publicly, turning intimacy into performance. Bardot spoke later of feeling imprisoned by her own fame. The same public that celebrated her freedom demanded constant access to her body and emotions. The contradiction was profound. She represented liberation on screen while experiencing confinement in reality. The media rarely acknowledged this tension. Instead, it framed her struggles as scandal or fragility, reinforcing the very pressures that caused them. Bardot learned early that fame was not a form of empowerment, but a transaction that extracted a heavy personal cost. This growing sense of suffocation fueled her eventual decision to leave cinema altogether. Music, media appearances, and film roles had given her global recognition, but they had also stripped her of peace. By the late 1960s, she was already imagining a life beyond performance, one in which attention could be replaced by purpose. The seeds of her withdrawal were planted here, in the space between admiration and intrusion, between art and exposure. What followed was not retreat, but transformation. By the early 1970s, Brigitte Bardot had reached a point few stars ever dare to acknowledge, let alone act upon. She was still internationally famous, still commercially valuable, and still central to the public imagination. Yet internally, she had already begun to detach. The relationship between herself and cinema had become strained, even adversarial. What once felt like expression now felt like exposure. What once promised freedom now demanded endurance. For Bardot, acting had ceased to be an art and had become an obligation. Film sets no longer felt creative but claustrophobic. Scripts repeated familiar patterns, asking her to perform versions of herself that the public already believed it understood. Directors wanted BB, not Brigitte. They wanted the image, the shorthand, the recognizable silhouette of desire and rebellion, stripped of interiority. She felt increasingly that her presence on screen no longer belonged to her. Every movement was anticipated, every gesture interpreted through a lens she did not control. Even attempts at more serious or restrained performances were swallowed by expectation. The audience arrived knowing what it wanted to see, and that expectation shaped everything. Behind the scenes, Bardot was exhausted. Years of relentless scrutiny had eroded her sense of privacy and safety. She lived with the constant awareness of being watched, followed, and photographed. Fame was no longer a byproduct of success. It was an occupying force. The decision to leave cinema did not come in a single dramatic moment. It was gradual, shaped by disillusionment rather than defiance. Bardot began to recognize that continuing to act would require a kind of emotional surrender she was no longer willing to give. To remain in film meant continuing to offer herself up as an object of consumption, a role she found increasingly intolerable. When she finally announced her retirement in 1973, the reaction was disbelief. She was only 39 years old. Many assumed it was a publicity gesture, a temporary withdrawal. Others interpreted it as evidence of fragility, a refusal to cope with success. Few understood it for what it truly was, an act of self-preservation. For Bardot, walking away was not a rejection of art, but a reclamation of autonomy. She chose silence over spectacle, retreat over repetition. In leaving cinema, she was not abandoning her audience so much as refusing to continue a relationship that had become profoundly unbalanced. Her withdrawal was deliberate and uncompromising. She did not seek a farewell tour, nor did she leave the door open for a triumphant return. Once she stopped acting, she did not look back. Interviews became rare, appearances ceased. She retreated to the south of France, distancing herself physically and emotionally from the industry that had defined her public life. What followed was not a void, but a reorientation. Without cameras or scripts, Bardot confronted a quieter but more difficult task, redefining herself outside the gaze that had shaped her identity since adolescence. The absence of constant attention was both relief and reckoning. For the first time, she was no longer performing. Walking away cost her adoration, relevance in popular media, and the safety net that fame provides. But it gave her something she valued far more: control. In choosing to leave at the height of her fame, Bardot rejected the idea that success must be endlessly extended, that value lies in visibility alone. Her exit from cinema remains one of the most striking acts of withdrawal in modern cultural history. It was not framed as a protest, yet it carried quiet defiance. In a world that demanded she remain forever available, Bardot chose absence. That absence would soon be filled not with obscurity, but with purpose. Bardot's love for animals had always been present. As her disillusionment with human institutions deepened, that affection became a calling. She was disturbed by the cruelty she witnessed, particularly within industries that treated animals as commodities rather than living beings. Unlike many celebrities who lent their names to causes, Bardot committed fully. She educated herself, confronted authorities, and used her own resources to fund action. She sold personal possessions to support animal protection efforts. Eventually, she established a foundation, the Brigitte Bardot Foundation, dedicated entirely to animal welfare. It funded shelters, rescue operations, and advocacy campaigns across the world. Bardot's activism was not gentle or diplomatic. She spoke bluntly, often emotionally, driven by a sense of urgency and moral outrage. For some, her passion was inspiring. For others, it was uncomfortable. Bardot did not seek consensus. She sought results. As she withdrew further from public life, Bardot's statements became increasingly polarizing. She expressed strong opinions on social and political issues, some of which sparked legal consequences and widespread criticism. These controversies complicated her legacy. Admirers of her animal advocacy struggled with her views on other matters. Critics questioned whether her moral absolutism extended selectively. Bardot did not apologize for her beliefs. She saw herself as consistent, guided by instinct rather than ideology. To her supporters, this was integrity. To her detractors, it was inflexibility. What remained undeniable was her refusal to soften her voice for acceptance. Bardot did not adapt herself to public expectations. She stayed, for better or worse, defiantly herself. In her later decades, Bardot lived largely out of the spotlight. She rarely appeared publicly, communicating instead through letters, statements, and her foundation's work. She surrounded herself with animals, finding in them the peace that human society had often denied her. Her home became both sanctuary and symbol, a retreat from the world she had once dominated. While the public continued to mythologize her image, Bardot herself lived quietly, committed to causes she believed transcended fame. Her influence did not fade. Films were revisited, fashion rediscovered her aesthetic, new generations encountered her work through retrospectives and cultural analysis. Yet Bardot remained distant, uninterested in nostalgia. In her final years, Bardot's health declined, but her convictions did not. She continued to speak out on behalf of animals, urging governments and individuals to take responsibility. When she died on the 28th of December 2025 at the age of 91, the reaction was immediate and global. Tributes acknowledged her impact on cinema, fashion, and activism. Commentators reflected on her contradictions, her courage, and the cost of a life lived so publicly and so fiercely. Her death marked the end of an era, but not the end of her influence. Brigitte Bardot remains difficult to categorize. She was not simply a film star, nor merely an activist. She was a cultural rupture, a figure who forced society to confront its own contradictions around desire, freedom, and exploitation. She expanded what women could be on screen, even as she suffered for that expansion. She rejected fame, even as she reshaped it. She devoted her later life to protecting the voiceless, even as her own voice provoked controversy. To tell Bardot's story is not to resolve these tensions, but to acknowledge them. Her life resists simplification. It demands reflection rather than judgment. Brigitte Bardot lived many lives within one. She was a dancer, an actress, a symbol, a rebel, an activist, and ultimately a recluse by choice. She embodied beauty and burden in equal measure. Her story reminds us that icons are still human, that liberation often comes at a cost, and that walking away can be as powerful as standing center stage. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, Bardot remained uncompromising in her beliefs, devoted to causes that mattered to her, and indifferent to whether the world approved. In that refusal to conform, she left behind something more enduring than glamour. She left a legacy of defiance, complexity, and conviction that continues to challenge how we think about fame, freedom, and responsibility. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Biographies, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactbiographies.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering history, warfare, disasters, mysteries, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/biographiescoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.